When a homeless Vietnam veteran was humiliated and thrown out of a diner for trying to buy a simple cup of coffee with his last $20, he had no idea that dozens of leather-clad bikers had been watching from across the street. Within minutes, the entire block was lined with roaring Harley-Davidsons as the Hells Angels formed a protective wall around the old soldier, ready to defend his honor in ways that would shock everyone inside that restaurant. But what happened next, when these unlikely heroes walked through those diner doors? Did they seek revenge, or did they choose something far more powerful? The first drops of November rain began to streak the windows of Murphy's Diner as the lunch rush settled into its familiar rhythm. The clatter of plates and murmur of conversation creating a warm cocoon against the growing storm outside. Steam rose from coffee cups while the smell of grilled onions and fresh bread filled the air, and families huddled closer together in their vinyl booths, grateful for the comfort of hot food and dry shelter. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a golden glow that made Murphy's feel like a sanctuary from the gray world beyond its walls, where business suits mixed with work boots, and everyone found common ground in the universal language of comfort food and friendly service. But outside on the weathered wooden bench, Harold Martinez sat motionless in the cold, his calloused fingers tracing the edges of a $20 bill he'd been saving for 3 weeks, watching through the rain-streaked glass as people enjoyed the simple pleasure of a warm meal. His jacket, once military green but now faded to the color of old moss, bore patches that told the story of his service: 82nd Airborne Vietnam, 1968 to 1970, and a purple heart pin that caught the gray light filtering through the clouds like a small beacon of forgotten honor. The fabric had worn thin at the elbows and shoulders, threads unraveling like the life he'd once known. But Harold still wore it with the careful attention of a man who understood that some things deserved respect, even when the world had stopped offering it in return. His boots, cracked and resoled twice over, had once marched through rice paddies and jungle paths, had carried him home from a war that still visited him, in dreams filled with helicopter rotors and the faces of friends who never made it past 19. Now they carried him from shelter to shelter, from soup kitchen to street corner, through a different kind of battlefield, where the enemy was indifference, and the casualties were measured in dignity, lost, and hope abandoned. Harold's stomach cramped with hunger as he breathed in the aroma of bacon drifting from the restaurant's exhaust vent. But something deeper than physical need kept him frozen on that bench. The way mothers pulled their children closer when they noticed him, the way conversations died when he walked past, the way his own reflection in storefront windows had become a stranger he barely recognized. All of it had worn him down to something fragile and afraid. His hands shook as he unfolded the $20 bill, smoothing out its creases with the same careful attention he'd once given to folding the American flag, remembering when those same hands had been steady enough to apply pressure to bleeding wounds and call in coordinates for medical evacuations under fire. The weight of his empty stomach felt nothing compared to the weight of invisibility, of being forgotten by the very country he'd bled for, of existing in the spaces between other people's awareness, like smoke that dissipates the moment anyone tries to grasp it. Inside the warm glow of Murphy's, manager Rick Donovan noticed the figure on the bench and felt his jaw tighten with familiar irritation, the way it always did when transients lingered too long near his establishment. Their presence a reminder of failures and fractures in the social contract that made his customers uncomfortable and, more importantly, reluctant to return. Finally, desperation overcame Harold's fear, and he rose slowly from the bench, his joints protesting after an hour in the cold, and walked toward Murphy's entrance with the measured steps of someone who had learned that sudden movements could shatter fragile hopes. The brass handle felt warm under his palm as he pulled open the door, and the bell above chimed with a cheerful sound that seemed to mock the heaviness in his chest, announcing his presence to a room full of people who immediately began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The conversations didn't stop entirely, but they changed, became quieter, more watchful, as eyes flickered toward him then quickly away, as if direct contact might somehow contaminate their peaceful meal. Harold paused just inside the entrance for a moment, water dripping from his jacket onto the checkered linoleum, feeling the weight of their judgment settle on his shoulders like snow that never melts. "Excuse me, sir," Harold said to Rick, his voice carrying the respectful tone he'd learned in basic training 40 years ago, the words careful and measured, despite the way his heart hammered against his ribs. "I was wondering if I could get just a cup of coffee and maybe a piece of toast." He extended the $20 bill with hands that trembled, not from the cold, but from the vulnerability of hope, from the terrible risk of asking for something as simple as dignity in a place where he clearly wasn't wanted. The money represented 3 weeks of collecting bottles from dumpsters, of standing with a cardboard sign at intersections while commuters avoided his eyes, of sleeping in doorways and waking before dawn to avoid the police, every dollar a small victory against the indifference of a world that had moved on without him. Rick looked at his last 20, then at Harold's worn face, at the way the other customers had gone quiet with anticipation, and felt something cold and decisive crystallize in his chest. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent restaurant like a verdict, each word landing with the force of a gavel. "You need to leave. Now." His metal caught the fluorescent light for just a moment, a flash of purple and gold that spoke of blood shed on foreign soil, of a 19-year-old boy who had crawled through rice paddies to drag wounded comrades to safety, who had earned his country's recognition with shrapnel in his leg, and nightmares that still woke him 40 years later. But Rick saw only the unwashed hair, the torn clothing, the threat to his establishment's reputation, and Harold saw in Rick's gaze the same cold dismissal he'd encountered at job interviews, at shelters, at every door that had closed in his face since the factory layoffs began and his small savings disappeared into medical bills and rent he could no longer afford. The $20 bill fluttered to the floor as Harold's hand went limp with shame, and in the terrible silence that followed, the only sounds were the hiss of the grill, the drumming of rain against windows, and the soft rustle of people pretending not to watch as a man who had once sworn an oath to defend them gathered the last shreds of his dignity and turned away from their warmth, walking back into the downpour that seemed kinder than the shelter they had denied him. As Harold pushed through the glass door back into the storm, the humiliation burning in his chest like acid, he had no idea that salvation was already thundering toward him. Something extraordinary began to stir in the distance, a low rumble that seemed to rise from the earth itself, growing stronger with each passing second until it became a thunder that made the restaurant windows vibrate in their frames. Through the gray curtain of water streaming from the sky, chrome began to glint like silver lightning, and the unmistakable roar of Harley-Davidson engines filled the air with a sound that spoke of power and brotherhood, and roads that stretched beyond the horizon. One by one, motorcycles emerged from the mist like mechanical cavalry, their riders wrapped in black vests that glistened with raindrops, death's head patches emblazoned on their backs, with the words "Hell's Angels" stitched in bold letters that left no room for misinterpretation. The lead bike pulled up directly in front of Harold, its engine rumbling with barely contained energy, and when the rider removed his helmet, his face was weathered by sun and wind and years of riding free, but his eyes held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his intimidating presence. "Brother," he said, his voice cutting through the downpour and engine noise with surprising warmth, and Harold looked up in confusion, his weathered face streaming with water, unable to comprehend why this mountain of a man was speaking to him with such respect. The biker's arms were covered in tattoos that told stories of their own, an eagle clutching a banner that read Semper Fi, dates that marked tours in Vietnam and Iraq, and names of fallen comrades etched in black ink like prayers written on skin. "We saw what happened in there," the biker continued, gesturing toward Murphy's where faces now pressed against the windows in disbelief. "And that ain't right." More machines arrived until the entire street was lined with bikes, their riders dismounting in perfect synchronization, boots hitting wet pavement with the sound of an army taking position. Harold stood frozen in the center of this black-clad brotherhood, still clutching the crumpled money, unable to process how his moment of deepest humiliation had somehow summoned these unlikely angels from the storm. Meanwhile, inside the restaurant, Rick's face had gone white as he watched the growing assembly outside, his hands shaking as he counted the motorcycles, 10, 20, 30, until he lost count and could only stare at the wall of leather and chrome that had materialized in response to his casual cruelty. The lead biker placed a massive hand on Harold's shoulder, and through the warmth of that simple touch, Harold felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the recognition of one warrior by another, the acknowledgement that his service and sacrifice still mattered to someone in this indifferent world. Sarah pressed her face to the window, watching as more bikers joined the formation, their presence transforming the quiet street into something that felt like a reckoning, and she turned to Rick with eyes that blazed with sudden understanding. "That man has a purple heart," she whispered, but her words carried across the now silent Murphys like an accusation, and Rick felt his throat go dry as the full weight of what he had done began to settle on his shoulders like stones. The lead biker's arm remained steady around Harold's shoulders as they walked together toward the restaurant's entrance, the brotherhood following behind them, like a tide of leather and purpose, their boots creating a rhythm on the wet pavement that sounded like justice marching home. Through the rain-streaked windows, Harold could see the terror in Rick's eyes, the way the manager's hands trembled as he gripped the counter, finally understanding that some actions echo far beyond their intended moment, that disrespecting one veteran meant disrespecting all who had worn the uniform. The bell chimed again as the door opened, but this time the sound carried weight and consequence, announcing not a supplicant seeking charity, but a decorated soldier returning with his brothers in arms to claim the respect that should never have been denied. "This man served his country with honor," the lead biker said quietly, his words falling into the absolute silence of the establishment, like stones dropped into still water, each syllable rippling outward to touch every customer who had watched Harold's humiliation without speaking up. "He earned his purple heart, crawling through enemy fire to save his squad mates. And he deserves better than what you gave him." Rick's face flushed red, then went pale again, as he stared at Harold's military honor, really seeing the decoration for the first time, understanding that the homeless man he'd dismissed so easily had once been willing to die for strangers, had bled for the very freedom that allowed Rick to run his business and make his cruel choices. The worn bill still lay crumpled on the floor where Harold had dropped it, and Sarah quickly retrieved it, smoothing out its wrinkles with gentle hands, before offering it back to Harold with tears in her eyes and an apology that came from somewhere deep in her chest. "Coffee and toast are on the house," Rick managed to say, his voice cracking with the weight of his embarrassment. "And anything else you'd like, sir." But the bikers had already guided Harold to the best table in the restaurant, where they surrounded him like a protective wall, sharing stories of their own service, of brothers they'd lost, of the bonds that transcended appearance or circumstance, or the judgments of people who had never heard bullets whistle overhead. Steam rose from Harold's coffee cup as he sat among these unexpected guardians, listening to their tales of Afghanistan and Iraq, of coming home to a country that didn't always understand what they'd sacrificed, and for the first time in years, he felt the warmth of belonging, of being seen not as a burden, but as a brother. As the storm continued to rage outside and the motorcycles gleamed like sentinels along the curb, Harold looked around the table at faces that bore their own scars, their own stories of service and struggle, and realized that sometimes salvation comes roaring down the street on Harley-Davidsons, delivered by angels who wear black vests instead of wings, and who understand that honor isn't diminished by hard times or homelessness or the cruelty of those who have forgotten what sacrifice means. The last image that would linger in everyone's memory was the sight of Harold's face as he smiled for the first time in months, surrounded by brotherhood, holding his coffee cup with steady hands, while outside the downpour washed the street clean, and the bikes stood guard, like chrome monuments, to the truth that no one who has served should ever stand alone.